In the fall of 1761, a wealthy merchant named Thomas Whitmore arrived at the gates of Covenant Academy for Christian Youth in Salem, Massachusetts, demanding answers about his son's death. What he uncovered behind those respected walls would shake colonial society to its core and reveal a horrific legacy of abuse that had remained hidden in plain sight for nearly 30 years. At the center of the academy stood the Fletcher family headmaster, Josiah, his wife Martha, and their son Samuel, revered across New England for providing a superior Christian education to the children of the elite. But behind the school's polished image of strict biblical teaching and moral discipline was a dark system of psychological and physical torment, one that ultimately took the lives of 89 children. For centuries, the truth about Covenant Academy remained buried, protected by powerful families with too much to lose. That is, until 1987, when renovations at Salem's Old North Church uncovered long-forgotten documents that revealed the full scale of the horror. These included coded letters, financial records showing payments for so-called experimental education methods, and, most disturbingly, medical reports detailing the suffering of students under what the school called intensive spiritual correction, cruel euphemism for torture. These techniques, horrifyingly innovative at the time, would later be used throughout the American colonies. The Academy's influence stretched far beyond its ivy-covered walls. Many students who survived its brutal methods went on to become judges, military leaders, and government officials, carrying with them a deep understanding of how fear and pain could be used to control others. The same methods would reappear during the Revolutionary War, the Indian Wars, and in the early development of the American prison system. But before we expose the twisted truth behind one of Salem's most respected institutions, a warning: this story isn't for the faint of heart. It's for those courageous enough to confront the cruelty hidden beneath the surface of American history. If you're one of them, join our community of truth seekers. Hit subscribe. Tell us what state you're watching from in the comments, because what we're about to reveal has been buried for over 2 centuries and will forever change the way you viewed the founding of this nation. Let's go back to the beginning. 1734, in a town still haunted by its dark past, in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the 1730s were a time of prosperity and intense religious devotion. Salem, once infamous for the witch trials just 40 years earlier, had rebuilt itself as a beacon of Puritan values, a bustling port filled with merchants, shipbuilders, and theologians. But the trauma of the past still lingered. The people of Salem had learned the high price of questioning authority, and that lesson made them vulnerable to the kind of tyranny disguised as righteousness that would soon take root. It was in this climate of religious zeal and social ambition that Josiah Fletcher founded Covenant Academy. In the winter of 1734, Fletcher was a towering figure, literally and figuratively standing over 6'6", with piercing gray eyes and a deep, commanding voice. He was a graduate of Harvard Divinity School, and had strong ties to Massachusetts aristocracy, making him a trusted figure among the colony's upper class. But Fletcher also carried the scars of Salem's dark past. At just 9 years old, he had witnessed the witch trials and claimed the experience gave him a divine mission to root out sin at any cost. His wife, Martha Fletcher, born Martha Thornfield, was just as intense. Sharp, strategic, and fiercely religious, she believed deeply in the use of severe discipline to shape young minds. Her family, well earned through the brutal transatlantic slave trade, provided the funds needed to open the academy. At 8, Martha was well versed in Puritan theology, especially the harsh, child-rearing philosophies of Increase and Cotton Mather. She believed a child's will had to be completely broken in order to save their soul. Martha looked the part of a caring mother, soft brown hair, warm blue eyes, but she could switch from gentle encouragement to terrifying authority in an instant. Her psychological manipulation would become central to the Academy's darker operations. Their son, Samuel Fletcher, was 23 when the school opened. He had inherited both his parents' imposing presence and their relentless vision of Christian education. Tall and intense like his father, Samuel quickly became an active force in shaping the Academy's twisted curriculum. With his mother's sharp blue eyes and a mind honed by years of rigorous religious study, Samuel Fletcher became the chief disciplinarian at Covenant Academy and the main enforcer of its most extreme correctional practices. After studying for 3 years at Yale College, where he was exposed to cutting-edge ideas in moral philosophy and education, Samuel brought that knowledge back to Salem. But instead of using it for enlightenment, he used it to craft a terrifyingly precise system for breaking the human spirit. Samuel's role at the Academy went far beyond traditional discipline. He kept meticulous records of each student's reactions to various punishments, documenting their breaking points, resistance tactics, and the most effective ways to shatter their psychological defenses. His journals, written in neat handwriting and filled with clinical detail, would eventually become crucial evidence of what the Academy really was. Covenant Academy sat on a sprawling estate just outside Salem, perched on a hill with a full view of the town below, close enough to watch over the community, but far enough away to carry out its disturbing practices without interference. The estate had once belonged to William Phipps, a wealthy merchant who fled the colony after his wife was accused of witchcraft. The property, rumored to be cursed, was purchased by the Fletchers for far less than it was worth giving them a grand campus far beyond what their initial funds should have afforded. The Academy's main building was a 3-story red brick structure built with bricks imported from England. Its architecture, symmetrical and severe, mirrored the strict Puritan obsession with order. At its center stood a tall bell tower, the crown jewel of the building. The bell, cast in London and engraved with verses from Ecclesiastes about the value of discipline, had aged into a haunting greenish patina. Its deep, mournful toll rang out 7 times a day, summoning students to prayer from dawn until long after sunset. Inside, the atmosphere was both scholarly and oppressive. Floor contained classrooms with high ceilings and tall windows. By day, sunlight poured in, but by night, the flickering candlelight created eerie, shifting shadows that danced along the walls lined with portraits of grim Puritan ministers and biblical scenes of divine punishment. Every corner of the space whispered judgment and control. On the second floor was the Academy's library, one of the largest theological collections in New England. It held not only traditional religious texts, but also volumes on moral philosophy, human behavior, and the psychology of spiritual conversion. These works laid the theoretical foundation for the Academy's controversial methods. A restricted section, accessible only to the Fletcher family and a few trusted allies, held writings on interrogation, torture used during the Spanish Inquisition, and detailed accounts of the Salem witch trials used as how-to guides for breaking down resistance. The third floor housed the Fletchers' private living quarters, along with several small, isolated rooms used for what they called individual spiritual counseling. Each of these chambers measured only 8 by 10 feet, furnished with just a wooden chair, a Bible, a prayer book, and a single candle. The walls were stark white, decorated with scripture passages focused on judgment, punishment, and submission to divine authority. On either side of the compound stood the dormitories, each one housing 35 boys in carefully controlled conditions. Each dormitory contained 18 beds lined up in perfect rows. Roommates were not randomly assigned. They were selected based on a complex system that analyzed family status, academic performance, and psychological profile. Older students, those who had fully embraced the Academy's philosophy, were placed in charge as overseers. They served as informants, reporting any signs of rebellion, doubt, or critical thinking among the younger students. At the northern edge of the grounds stood the Academy's chapel, built in the stark no-frills style of Puritan architecture. It had plain glass windows, bare wooden pews, had a massive oak pulpit raised 8 feet above the congregation to symbolize the spiritual dominance of the minister. The building's acoustics were designed to amplify sermons and to ensure that even whispered conversations from the audience could be overheard by those in power. Behind the chapel was the most chilling part of the campus, a small cemetery surrounded by a wrought iron fence. It would eventually hold 89 headstones, each one marking a young life lost during enrollment. The cemetery's location, clearly visible from the dormitory windows, served as a daily reminder of the cost of failure. But the darkest secrets of Covenant Academy were hidden underground, beneath the main building in the estate's original stone foundation was a series of secret chambers that the Fletchers referred to as reflection rooms. Some were barely large enough for a person to lie down. Others were designed for group punishment. These rooms weren't for reflection. They were for the Academy's most extreme disciplinary measures, what modern minds would recognize as torture. Despite all this, the Academy was publicly marketed as a premier educational institution, a place where elite Christian boys could grow into tomorrow's leaders. Flyers and brochures were sent to wealthy families all across New England, promising a unique curriculum that blended classical education with deep biblical instruction. What they didn't reveal was the hidden cost, a methodical system built not to educate, but to dominate, to create men who understood how to use pain, fear, and control to maintain power. The circumstances surrounding Benjamin Hartwell's death didn't spark suspicion. Instead, they triggered an outpouring of sympathy for the Academy and admiration for the spiritual rigor of its teachings. One of the most influential voices of the time, Reverend Cotton Mather, the same minister whose sermons once fueled the Salem witch trials, publicly praised the Fletchers. He applauded them for creating a place where young men could experience true spiritual awakening, even if it meant sacrificing their earthly lives for heavenly glory. His endorsement, published in the Massachusetts Gazette and widely reprinted, transformed Benjamin's death into a testament of divine grace rather than a tragedy. Inspired by Mather's words, several wealthy families immediately applied to enroll their sons. To them, Benjamin's death was proof that Covenant Academy could produce the kind of intense religious transformation they believed essential for future leaders. Within weeks, the Academy's waiting list surged, growing from just a few names to over 50. This gave the Fletchers the ability to become even more selective. With new demand came new admission procedures, interviews with both parents and students, medical exams to assess physical endurance, and psychological evaluations to predict how each child would respond to pressure and manipulation. The years following Benjamin's death set a pattern that would define the Academy's operations for the next 2 decades. Covenant Academy slowly transformed from a school into a laboratory for human experimentation, where the line between religious discipline and outright torture became harder to see. To student deaths became disturbingly routine, never more than 6 per year, so as not to draw outside attention, never fewer than 2 to keep their program going. Enrollment was kept steady at 35 students, with new arrivals quickly replacing those who had graduated to heavenly glory, as Martha Fletcher euphemistically put it in her letters to parents. Each death followed a predictable pattern. A student would make a small mistake, talking during prayers, falling behind in scripture memorization, seeming homesick, or questioning doctrine. That student would then be sentenced to intensive reflection in the basement chambers. Punishments varied depending on the student's social status, psychological profile, and the specific experiment being tested at the time. The basement chambers themselves evolved from simple isolation rooms into purpose-built torture environments designed to test different methods of breaking human resistance. The smallest cells, just 4 by 6 feet, with 5-foot ceilings, were used to induce claustrophobia and spatial disorientation. Students confined in these spaces often developed panic attacks, followed by a complete emotional collapse. Larger chambers, 12 by 15 feet, were used for sensory deprivation experiments. These rooms were painted pitch black and contained nothing but a bucket. Straw mattresses were sometimes removed, forcing boys to sleep on the cold stone floor. Some rooms had sloped floors that made it impossible to lie down, wearing students out physically and mentally. Others had narrowing walls that created the terrifying illusion that the room was slowly closing in. Martha Fletcher's psychological sessions grew even more advanced during this time. Held in special third-floor rooms, her spiritual counseling employed techniques she had studied from the Spanish Inquisition and the Salem witch trials. Her method: identify each student's deepest fear, lost parent, a desperate need to succeed, guilt over a past mistake, and then exploit it. Students with close family ties were told their parents had died suddenly or lost their fortunes. High achievers were falsely informed they had disgraced their families. Doubters were told they had already damned their souls beyond salvation. Meanwhile, Samuel Fletcher took over the data side of operations. His journals, written in meticulous detail, documented every reaction: how long students could survive without food or light, what combinations of isolation and pressure triggered breakdowns, and which tactics led to confessions or total submission. His work amounted to some of the first systematic studies of torture techniques ever conducted in the American colonies. The results were quietly shared with colonial officials looking for better ways to interrogate dissenters and control criminal suspects. By 1740, the Fletchers had perfected not only their methods, but their cover-up systems. Arthur kept detailed records of each student's spiritual journey, portraying even the most horrifying deaths as blessed transitions. These bound leather volumes, housed in the Academy's private library, served both as documentation and recruitment materials. The public image of the Academy was upheld by a wide network: former students, wealthy parents, and religious leaders, many of whom had been persuaded or manipulated to believing in the Academy's value. Alumni who survived knew one thing for sure: never speak out. They had seen what happened to those who tried. Samuel Fletcher would occasionally visit alumni events, not just to reconnect, but to remind survivors of their lifelong duty to protect the Academy's reputation. It was a message understood without words. Parents who lost children received carefully worded letters from Martha on the anniversary of their son's death, letters praising the spiritual victory of the deceased, often including pressed flowers, hand-copied Bible verses, or even sketches of what Martha claimed were peaceful, angelic expressions on their faces as they died. Back on campus, surviving students developed underground coping mechanisms. Learned to read subtle signs, the way Samuel's eyes narrowed in class, the way Martha tapped her fingers during chapel, or how Headmaster Fletcher's voice changed when speaking about purification. Most importantly, they learned the unspoken rule: stay silent or suffer. The Academy's reputation kept growing through the 1740s, while the occasional whisper about student deaths surfaced in taverns or markets. They were quickly silenced, often by Salem's most powerful families, many of whom had financial stakes in the Academy's continued success. One doctor, Ephraim Wilkins, occasionally raised doubts after examining students' bodies. The physical evidence, he noted, didn't match the official cause of death, usually listed as spiritual fever. But social pressure and discreet financial thanks convinced him to stop asking questions. Those who pushed further faced ruin. One magistrate, Thomas Blackwood, received an anonymous letter describing disturbing practices at the Academy. When he began investigating, he was suddenly accused of financial misconduct, forced to resign, and eventually driven out of town. The town's religious leadership played a critical role in protecting the academy. Ministers were frequent guest speakers. Theologians praised Fletcher's methods in published writings. And the chapel hosted some of the most important religious events in Massachusetts, including the ordinations of ministers who would later lead the Great Awakening Revival movement in 1743. Even Reverend Jonathan Edwards, one of the most brilliant theological minds in American history, visited Covenant Academy. His sermon, delivered from the towering pulpit, praised the Fletchers for their unflinching commitment to breaking sinful hearts in the name of God. His support helped silence anyone who might have questioned the Academy's extreme methods. But beneath the public image of holiness and education, the truth was beginning to leak into the shadows. A small group of colonial officials had been quietly briefed on what the Fletchers were really doing. They weren't just running a school. They were conducting covert researcher, brutal, systematic study of human control with the potential to help colonial authorities build better tools for domination, and no one dared to stop them. As unrest grew across the colonies, Covenant Academy's methods were quietly being tested beyond its walls. Colonial leaders, growing increasingly nervous about the population's loyalty amid rising tensions with Britain, saw value in the Fletchers' system of psychological manipulation and physical control. The techniques being perfected at the Academy were soon recognized as powerful tools for controlling political dissidents, religious minorities, and anyone who might challenge the existing power structure. But in the winter of 1747, an unexpected development occurred, one that would, years later, help unravel the Academy's secret. Jonathan Prescott, a 16-year-old student, began keeping a secret journal. Unlike the other boys who had learned to suppress their emotions to survive, Jonathan had both a sharp intellect and an unwavering sense of justice. His father was William Prescott, Essex County's chief magistrate, and his family had a long-standing reputation for integrity and public service. Raised with a belief that truth must be documented, no matter the cost, Jonathan decided to write down everything, using a blade and tremendous patience. He carved out a hidden compartment inside his prayer book where he concealed his entries. Over the months, Jonathan recorded precise details about the Academy's punishment system, descriptions of the basement reflection chambers, the physical conditions, and the emotional patterns observed in students before they were chosen for punishment. Most importantly, he began to notice something that others hadn't dared consider. The punishments weren't random. In a chilling journal entry dated February 12, 1748, he wrote, "The masters do not choose randomly among us for their attentions. They watch us as naturalists watch animals, studying who among us shows leadership, who resists control, who asks difficult questions. Those are the ones they choose for what they call advanced spiritual development." Jonathan realized the Academy had a classification system. Students with strong emotional ties to their families were subjected to psychological trials to test emotional manipulation. Those from military backgrounds were tested for pain tolerance, and the brightest minds, boys who dared to question authority, were subjected to complex protocols aimed at breaking intellectual resistance. But the most disturbing discovery came in early spring, after being punished for arriving 2 minutes late to morning chapel. Jonathan was assigned to clean Headmaster Josiah Fletcher's office. There, hidden inside a locked cabinet, he found a collection of letters correspondence between Josiah Fletcher and high-ranking colonial officials. What he read over the course of several secret visits changed everything. The letters revealed that Covenant Academy was part of a larger colonial network developing what officials referred to as enhanced spiritual correction. This was a euphemism for state-sponsored psychological torture designed to break the will of political troublemakers, religious outliers, and anyone who posed a threat to colonial rule. One letter, signed by Thomas Hutchinson, powerful figure in the Massachusetts government, praised Fletcher's work for creating behavioral modifications with plausible deniability when students died. It even discussed plans to expand the program to other schools throughout New England. Another document, bearing the seal of the governor's office, framed the Academy's work as part of preparations for anticipated rebellion against Britain. The letter stressed the importance of training a generation of colonial leaders who had been conditioned from youth to enforce absolute control. Perhaps the most horrifying was a detailed report written by Samuel Fletcher, addressed to a secret committee of officials. The report outlined interrogation methods that left minimal physical evidence while maximizing psychological damage. It detailed the ideal lengths of confinement, combinations of stressors, and how best to extract confessions. Jonathan suddenly understood. The boys who died at the academy weren't dying from religious fervor. They were test subjects. The school was a covert laboratory operating under the guise of Christian education. And their victims were boys from wealthy families who would never risk scandal by accusing the institution of wrongdoing. By April 1748, Jonathan's situation became critical. His name began appearing more often in Martha Fletcher's spiritual reports. He was summoned more frequently for private sessions, and Josiah Fletcher began asking him pointed questions: his thoughts on colonial rule, his family's politics, and whether individual conscience should ever outweigh institutional authority. Even his friends began pulling away. The students, trained by fear and self-preservation, knew what it meant when someone was marked for special attention. Jonathan was being isolated. Around the same time, the Academy's environment began to change. Jonathan noticed new equipment arriving in the basement tryst, strange measuring tools, and surgical instruments. The chambers were being modified for longer confinement, and new rooms were excavated into the foundation. The final straw came on the night of April 18, 1748. Jonathan was caught reading a banned book in the library after hours of work by philosopher John Locke, which questioned Puritan theology and argued for reason over blind faith. It was all the justification the Fletchers needed. Samuel Fletcher immediately recommended Jonathan for intensive reflection. What followed was a chillingly organized internal review. Each Fletcher family member weighed in. Josiah Fletcher evaluated Jonathan's potential threat as someone with influence and moral authority. Martha Fletcher analyzed his psychological profile, recommending methods that could break him while extracting useful behavioral data. Samuel Fletcher assessed the evidence and proposed punishments that would serve both disciplinary and experimental objectives. On April 17, 1748, the family unanimously agreed Jonathan Prescott would become the next test subject. His case would provide insight into whether someone with high intelligence and strong family ties could be turned into a supporter of the very system that sought to destroy him. But what the Fletchers didn't know was this: Jonathan had been preparing for this moment. He had trained his body in secret, practiced breathing exercises, and rehearsed mental techniques to resist torture. Most importantly, he had hidden his journal, carefully protecting it from discovery. And as he was led down those cold stone steps into the pit, Academy's basement, to the place where so many boys had met their end, Jonathan carried not just his secret writings, but a plan that had taken weeks to build. A plan that would, in time, expose the truth about Covenant Academy to the world. Despite the constant pressure, Jonathan Prescott stayed conscious, focused, and strategic. As the son of Essex County's chief magistrate, he knew his status offered both danger and opportunity. Over several months, he had built a secret communication system with his father, embedding coded messages into his letters home. These messages, disguised with classical references that only educated readers would recognize, allowed him to expose the Academy's darkest secrets without raising suspicion. Chief Magistrate William Prescott, a sharp and observant man, had begun to notice unusual patterns in his son's letters. Quietly, he launched his own investigation into the Covenant Academy. Using his authority and political connections, to uncover disturbing evidence of a larger, hidden agenda, a program of psychological control disguised as education, operating. Across New England, the reflection chamber where Jonathan was placed was one of the newer, more sophisticated torture rooms. It measured about 8 by 10 feet, with a vaulted stone ceiling nearly 7 feet high. A small iron grate near the ceiling let in a sliver of daylight and air. The acoustics had been carefully engineered so that any sound Jonathan made could be heard. From a nearby monitoring room, the walls told their own horror stories: scratch marks, tallies of days, and unidentifiable stains. Iron rings embedded in the stone were clearly designed for restraint and torture, not prayer and reflection. As the heavy wooden door slammed shut, Jonathan immediately began putting his plan into action. He had smuggled in small food supplies, sewn into the lining of his jacket, using techniques he'd learned from studying colonial smuggling operations. More importantly, he had hidden away encoded documents, maps of the basement, notes on torture techniques, and copies of letters he had secretly read in Josiah Fletcher's office. These documents were hidden among old carvings left by previous victims. It's impossible to distinguish at a glance. For the first 3 days, the routine was predictable. Each day, Jonathan received stale bread and water from Marcus Whitmore, the son of a wealthy donor and a student himself. Marcus never made eye contact. He recited a short prayer and left in silence, cold, mechanical, and clearly instructed not to engage. But the real pressure came at night. Every evening, Martha Fletcher entered the chamber for extended spiritual counseling, which was nothing short of a psychological interrogation. Her techniques, refined over years, were coldly effective. With Jonathan, she took a particularly calculated approach. At first, she spoke softly, like a mother concerned for a wayward son. She quickly transitioned to probing questions about his personal beliefs, his family's political ties, and his understanding of submission to religious authority. She played mind games. She presented him with fabricated letters claiming his father had been disgraced due to Jonathan's heresy. She told him the governor himself had raised concerns about the Prescott family's loyalty. Every detail was strategically crafted, exploiting Jonathan's deepest fears, his family, and his belief in reason over blind faith. By the 4th day, Jonathan's body was showing signs of strain, weight loss, sleeplessness, exhaustion. But his mind remained sharp. In his moments alone, he used a metal shard hidden in his shoe to carve coded messages into the stone, tailing Martha's methods, analyzing her psychological tactics, and mapping out the full extent of the torture program. His writings revealed something profound. This wasn't simply religious extremism. It was a structured, scientific experiment. Every action taken by the Fletchers was logged, measured, and analyzed to develop methods of control and coercion that could be implemented throughout the colonial justice system. The basement wasn't just a dungeon. It was a lab. Each chamber was designed to test something different: isolation, sensory deprivation, physical pain, or emotional breakdown. And the Fletchers weren't just teachers. They were researchers, documenting everything with chilling precision. Then, on the 5th day, everything changed. Chief Magistrate William Prescott arrived unannounced with 2 armed constables. In his hand were legal documents giving him full authority to inspect the academy, citing credible concerns about the welfare of its students. The Fletcher family was caught off guard. The academy's tight schedule unraveled as they scrambled to maintain their image. The sight of armed officers made it clear this was an investigation, not a courtesy visit. Prescott's timing was strategic. Based on Jonathan's earlier messages, he knew exactly when his son would be receiving food and insisted on immediate access to him. Josiah Fletcher tried to delay, claiming Jonathan was in deep prayer and shouldn't be disturbed. Prescott refused, firmly reminding him that his authority overruled any religious excuses. As the guards stood watch, The Fletchers had no choice but to comply. Inside the chaos, Jonathan seized his chance. As the door opened, he slipped his hidden journal and documents through the ventilation grate. They fell into a narrow crevice between the building's old foundation stones, a place no one would think to look. There, the evidence would remain hidden for over a decade, until it was discovered in 1761. During an investigation by Thomas Whitmore, when the chamber door swung open and Chief Magistrate Prescott finally saw his son, the truth became undeniable. Jonathan was alive, but barely. He was pale, thin, trembling, and visibly traumatized. The chamber itself was a damning piece of evidence. Iron restraints, carved pleas for help, and a structure clearly designed for torment, not prayer. Any claim the Fletchers had about spiritual correction collapsed under the weight of what Prescott saw with his own eyes. What followed was a furious confrontation between a powerful colonial magistrate and a family that had, for decades, operated above suspicion. The Fletchers now faced exposure, not just for abuse, but for participating in a secret colonial project that reached into the highest offices of government. Prescott hadn't just come to save his son, he came with proof. During the weeks before his arrival, he had gathered damning evidence, letters, records, testimonies. He now had everything needed to force the Fletchers to confess or face prosecution and possibly execution for crimes against their students. That night in April 1748 marked the beginning of the end for Covenant Academy, but the institution would not fall immediately. Despite the evidence, connections ran deep. The academy would continue for another 13 years, claiming many more victims before its eventual exposure and destruction. But Jonathan Prescott's defiance, his record-keeping, and his father's intervention would eventually bring the truth to light, revealing the horrifying reality of a school that had disguised systematic torture as spiritual education and had served as a testing ground for state-sponsored control in the American colonies. The academy's unusually high student death rate had always raised quiet suspicions. But it wasn't until Chief Magistrate William Prescott began digging deeper that the truth started to emerge. Using his position and an extensive network of contacts in the colonial government, Prescott uncovered damning evidence, letters, financial records, and eyewitness accounts, so pointing to systematic torture and murder conducted under the cover of religious education. Prescott's investigation revealed that Covenant Academy was just one piece of a much larger operation, a government-backed program designed to develop advanced methods of social control. As tensions between the colonies and Britain escalated, colonial officials grew increasingly anxious about how to maintain order. They had concluded that traditional law enforcement wasn't enough. What they needed were techniques to break up persons will extract confessions and condition obedience, especially from the next generation of leaders. Elite schools like the academy were chosen as testing grounds. They offered the perfect cover, and their students, children of the most powerful families, were ideal subjects. Conditioning them meant ensuring that future colonial leaders would be molded into loyal, questioning servants of the status quo. When Magistrate Prescott confronted Headmaster Josiah Fletcher in the academy's main office that evening, the conversation quickly escalated from a father's concern to a full-blown reckoning with the truth. Fletcher, recognizing he was caught, made a bold move. He didn't deny anything. Instead, he tried to recruit Prescott. "Your son was chosen for our most advanced program," Fletcher explained with a chilling calmness. "His intelligence, willpower, and political heritage made him the perfect candidate for our final phase of research." He then revealed that the Academy's program had been commissioned by the highest levels of colonial leadership, including Governor Jonathan Belcher and members of the Massachusetts Council. The program wasn't a rogue experiment. It was sanctioned, funded, and carefully monitored. Students who died were not casualties of overzealous teaching. They were necessary sacrifices, perfecting tools to protect the colonies. Fletcher produced letters from key officials, one even from Thomas Hutchinson, who would later become the last civilian governor of Massachusetts. The letters authorized and praised the Academy's methods and discussed plans to replicate them in other institutions across the colonies. "We've developed techniques that can break even the strongest wills," Fletcher said. "Your son's resistance has given us valuable data. We're now ready to move to the next phase." Martha Fletcher entered next, presenting a clinical report on Jonathan's 5-day confinement. She meticulously recorded his responses to sleep deprivation, isolation, false information, and emotional manipulation. Her tone was detached and scientific, as if discussing a lab rat instead of a boy. She emphasized that breaking someone like Jonathan, intellectually gifted, emotionally resilient, and socially prominent, would give them critical insight into controlling future leaders. Her records also revealed how the Academy categorized its students. Military families, children, were tested for pain resistance. Merchant family sons were emotionally manipulated through false reports of financial ruin. Children of religious leaders were targeted to dismantle their faith. And all this was shared across a secret network of similar institutions in the colonies. Then Samuel Fletcher added his journal's cold, precise notes on the physiological and psychological effects of every torture technique they'd used. He had developed formulas for how long a person could endure starvation, isolation, or humiliation. His work was pioneering psychological warfare, decades before the term existed. The horror of the Academy wasn't just the 89 confirmed deaths. It was the deliberate, systematic construction of a machine for psychological and physical domination, one that had already begun influencing law enforcement and military tactics across the colonies. Prescott faced a moral crisis. If he exposed the Academy, he might save his son, but he would also reveal his knowledge of a program endorsed by the most powerful people in Massachusetts. It could destroy his career, endanger his family, and threaten the fragile balance of colonial governance. Fletcher made his offer. Jonathan would be released, and the Prescott family would be protected, but only if Prescott agreed to stay silent and to help expand the program into other schools across Essex County. "You have two choices," Fletcher said calmly. "Expose us, and you'll be seen as a traitor. Or join us and help ensure order is maintained in a world that's falling apart." Prescott agreed, but only under one condition: that the Fletchers provide written proof of everything. Letters, records, the entire program's documentation. He needed insurance. Fletcher agreed. That demand would prove to be the Academy's undoing. 13 years later, the winter of 1761, that documentation would resurface in the hands of Thomas Whitmore, wealthy shipping magnate with the power, will to finally bring the Academy to justice. Whitmore's son, Marcus, had died at the Academy in late 1760, another victim of the so-called spiritual fever. But Whitmore, unlike other grieving parents, had both the money and political clout to question the official story. And unlike them, he also had a letter written by his son just 3 days before his death. It painted a very different picture of the Academy. In veiled but clear language, Marcus described a brutal system of punishment and psychological control, not a sanctuary of faith and learning. His words, combined with the records hidden by Jonathan Prescott over a decade earlier, would blow open the conspiracy and expose the Academy's role in one of the darkest chapters of colonial American history. The official narrative that the Fletcher family promoted about Covenant Academy of strict but spiritual education was unraveling. In a final letter to his father, Marcus Whitmore described students disappearing after being selected for special spiritual guidance, and disturbing sounds coming from the basement late at night. His carefully worded warning made it clear he was beginning to understand the true danger he was in, fueled by grief and determination. Thomas Whitmore, powerful merchant with deep political ties, launched a private investigation. He hired a skilled team led by former magistrate Thomas Blackwood, a man forced out of Salem 13 years earlier for probing too deeply into the Academy's secrets. Blackwood and his team began a detailed inquiry that would ultimately uncover 3 decades of hidden atrocities. The breakthrough came when they found Jonathan Prescott's hidden journal, buried deep within the stone foundation of the Academy's basement chambers. Despite the years, the dry conditions preserved it remarkably well. The journal contained first-hand accounts of the Academy's torturous methods, diagrams of its psychological experiments, and, most damning of all, copies of letters proving that high-ranking colonial officials not only knew about the program, but funded it. This wasn't a rogue school. It was part of a widespread experimental network stretching across New England. Covenant Academy had been a prototype, its methods quietly adopted by other institutions, colonial law enforcement, and even the British military. Jonathan's documentation described in disturbing detail the various torture chambers, the psychological methods used to break students' minds, and data from experiments tracking how different personalities responded to stress, deprivation, and manipulation. Even more shocking were letters between Academy leadership and colonial officials. Clear evidence that the program had full political backing. Armed with this evidence, Whitmore built a legal case against the Fletcher family, not just for abuse and murder, but for treason against the crown. The Academy had been operating without British approval, and the techniques it developed were being used not to support royal authority, but to suppress and control the population, potentially even to prepare for rebellion. The revelation sent shockwaves through the colonial government. Officials faced a grim choice: either support an illegal torture program they had long ignored, or side with the crown and destroy the Fletcher family to protect their own futures. They chose the latter. In February 1762, Josiah Fletcher was arrested on charges of murder, torture, and conspiracy, but he died in jail before trial officially from a heart attack. Though many believed he was silenced to prevent further revelations, Martha and Samuel Fletcher were tried in secret. They were convicted for the deaths of students, but their trials were hidden from the public. Both were quietly executed in spring 1762. Official records claimed they died in prison from natural causes. In truth, the government wanted the entire scandal buried. The Academy was shut down and its buildings demolished. Workers sworn to secrecy leveled the site, and the land was sold to a local farmer named Ezekiel Morrison. But Morrison refused to grow anything where the basement had once been. He told neighbors the soil was cursed, plants grew, twisted, and died. Even his livestock avoided the area. Eventually, the land became unused pasture. The government sealed the Academy's records. Families of victims were paid hush money compensation in exchange for silence and non-disclosure agreements. The cover-up worked. For over 200 years, the Academy's story was hidden. Few surviving documents were dismissed as exaggerations. The public never knew the true horror that unfolded behind the Academy's walls. But the legacy of Fletcher Academy didn't end there. The techniques developed there, psychological torture, interrogation strategies, and behavioral conditioning, were passed down, refined, and used throughout American history. Former students brought these methods to the Revolutionary War. The tactics resurfaced during the Indian Wars, the Civil War, and even influenced psychological operations in both world wars. Often, the origin of these techniques was forgotten, but they were rooted in the colonial school's torture chambers. Whitmore's investigation revealed that other institutions across the colonies had similar programs: churches, seminaries, private schools, all experimenting with psychological control under the guise of moral instruction. What happened at Fletcher was just the most visible piece of a massive, hidden system. The fallout led to major reforms in colonial education and the creation of oversight policies to prevent future abuses. Families who lost children to the Academy became outspoken advocates for accountability. Many would become leaders in the fight for American independence, shaped by their personal experiences of unchecked institutional power. The story of Covenant Academy is a uniquely American tragedy. It shows how institutions that appear noble, religious, academic, prestigious can become vehicles for horrifying abuse when cloaked in power, secrecy, and ideology. The Academy's techniques didn't just die with it. They embedded themselves in American systems of law enforcement, military training, and government operations. Often unknowingly, modern institutions used strategies born in Fletcher's torture rooms. Jonathan Prescott's journal hidden for over a decade proved critical. Without it, the full extent of the abuse may never have been revealed. It serves as a reminder of the power of truth and the importance of preserving evidence. Even in the face of unimaginable odds, the story of the 89 students who died at the Fletcher Academy is more than a grim history. It's a warning. Institutions must be held accountable. Educational and religious freedom must never become shields for systemic cruelty. And the people must always remain vigilant, because the greatest threats to freedom often come dressed as progress. What do you think about this dark chapter in colonial American history? Could similar programs have existed elsewhere? And do you think the techniques developed back then still influence modern institutions today? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and if you found this story as haunting and important as we did, make sure to subscribe and click the notification bell for more hidden truths from America's past. History isn't just what's in the textbooks, it's the stories that were buried. Only by confronting them can we ensure they're never repeated.